Hello, everyone. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there with you in Korea. I really wanted to be, but unfortunately, it can't be helped this time. I'm very grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to present in this format instead. So let's move through this pretty quickly because 20 minutes is not a lot of time. When I first submitted an abstract to this conference almost 3 years ago now, the idea was that I wanted to see how Nagarjuna would um, counter ontic structural realism, or OSR. That's a metaphysical view that holds that there aren't any individuals with intrinsic nature, but that structure is ontologically fundamental. This is really popular right now in philosophy of physics. So for OSRs, structure just refers to networks of modal relations. That's a bit simplified compared to the traditional understanding of structure, which is a tiny bit more technical, but we'll touch on that later. For now, it's okay to just think of structure as collections of relations. So we know that Nagarjuna wouldn't want to agree with the OSRists because they're trying to describe the ultimate nature of reality. But in understanding how he would approach this issue, we need to understand what role relations play in his philosophy. Does he think that there are relations? Um, Usually, of course, a Madhyamaka would say, well, conventionally, yes, there are relations. Ultimately, no, they're not. But I'm going to try to show that things are a bit more complicated here. And by seeing how they're more complicated, we can better understand, I think, how Nagarjuna's philosophy holds together. So to approach this, I want to approach what it means for something to be conventionally true. I'm going to assume that conventionalism is the correct lens through which to interpret Samvriti Satya. That shouldn't be taken for granted. Just because we use the word convention to gloss Samvriti doesn't mean that they have the same semantic range, but I'm going to assume that's the case. Um, so the difference between what makes something Samvriti Satya and what makes it Paramartha Satya is whether or not it's true by convention or properly, fully true in the full sense without any qualification. So we're going to need to know what a convention is in order to know what the difference between these two things is. So conventionalism has a fairly significant, though not very well studied history in Euro-American philosophy. I think this book by Yamina Ben Menahem, which is excellent, I recommend it. It's, I think, the only real full-length study on the topic as such, is as conventionalism in this tradition. This tradition really starts out with Henri Poincaré, a French mathematician and scientist, and also a philosopher, who argued that the axioms of geometry were merely conventions, and also was somewhat of a founder of structural realism in the philosophy of science. I put realism in scare quotes because I don't think he was much of a realist. Um, but it is interesting for our point purposes that conventionalism and structuralism actually had the same root in the Euro-American tradition with him. He also thought that the existence of the external world was a convention, at least in later writings. And this isn't very well understood. I have a paper on this coming out soon if you're interested in that topic. But the point of this is just to point out that when I speak about conventionalism and using conventionalism to interpret Nagarjuna, it's this tradition that I'm referring to. And Poincaré's conventionalism went on to influence Carnap's conventionalism and Quine's conventionalism and Wittgenstein's. So this is the conventionalism that I'm talking about. And from this point of view, a convention is just a proposition that we can legitimately accept or reject by free choice based on convenience, not its truth value. We don't accept a convention because it's true or reject it because it's false. We accept or reject it because it's convenient to us at the time. And philosophical conventionalists, importantly, have never argued, including Nagarjuna, have never argued that we can simply choose what is true. Rather, there's a strict difference between what's true and what's merely a convention. And philosophical conventionalists have traditionally always argued simply that someone has mistaken a convention for a genuinely truth-bearing proposition, or vice versa. So Ben Menahem has this quote saying, that for conventionalists, the idea of truth by convention is incongruous. It's like meaningful nonsense. That might seem to contradict our idea of conventional truth, but I think this is just a semantic issue. really we could just, for the Buddhist case, we could just say the very idea of ultimate truth by convention is as incongruous, etc. And that has the same meaning as far as I can see. So I think semantics aside, this is pretty standard stuff and applies also to Buddhist conventionalists. So the prime example of a convention is a definition. So at some point, some people decided that some specific length was a meter. They didn't discover that. It's not written into the fabric of reality. They couldn't be right or wrong about it. It's just something that they decided. And so for Nagarjuna, he claims that existence and non-existence don't ultimately pertain to reality. And conventionalism gives us a very straightforward way of understanding what he could mean by this. Because if it's always a convention to say that something exists, then that's simply entailed. It simply entailed that it's never really true that something exists or doesn't exist. It's also important to note that the negation of a convention is necessarily also a convention. Because we can choose whether or not to accept a convention, that's just the same thing as saying that we can choose whether or not to accept this negation. So this gives us a straightforward way of understanding some of Nagarjuna's more esoteric claims. So for him, the argument isn't, for Nagarjuna that is, the argument isn't about the truth value of existence claims, but rather about whether or not they ultimately have truth values, whether or not they're conventions. And this is really the form that all philosophical conventionalism takes in our kind of English language tradition. So conventional choice is free, but it's important to note that it's not arbitrary. It's not about making up whatever you want. So for Poincaré, we can choose what geometrical axioms we want to use, but some of them are way better than others at helping us to think about space. For Buddhists, we'll be able to choose certain conventions, but some of them are very much better than others for teaching us about liberation from suffering. Um, and for the Buddhist case, a key point I want to make now is that conventional truth can't be exclusively made of conventions. It can't only involve conventions. And I think the easiest way to see that is by thinking about experiences. We can't choose our experiences, but sometimes we employ statements using conventions to report our experiences. And so we therefore can't decide whether or not to accept or reject those reports by free choice. So let me explain. An example is when we see some bright wispy stuff, sometimes we identify it as fire. And that's really helpful for when we want to say, well, there's some fire over there, or this room is on fire, and things like that. So it's helpful and very convenient for us to have the convention that fire exists. And we therefore kind of make that connection between an experience we have and a convention that's convenient to us. But once we've made that association, we can create more complex propositions expressing relations between experiences. So if I claim that there's always heat where there is fire, that is not something, and we understand what I mean, what experience is associated with heat and what experience is associated with fire. That's not something that we can just decide whether we want to accept or reject. We have to discover that by experience. We have to discover if our experiences of heat and of fire are associated in that way. So in this case, at least, empirical relations aren't conventionally stipulated. I mean, if Nagarjuna says they were, I don't think we should even believe him because we definitely can't choose our experiences. However, they can only be described with reference to ontologies which are conventionally stipulated. So in that sense, propositions reporting empirical relations, they can only be conventionally true because they're couched in ontologies which are only exist by convention, because things, according to Nāgārjuna, can only exist by convention. But nevertheless, they have genuine truth values, and those truth values are determined by the reality of experience, not by our choice. So they operate this kind of middle ground, I think, where they're conventionally true, but they aren't conventions. And they're determined by reality, but they're not ultimately real at least not in any way that we can conceptualize them, because we can only conceptualize them using conventions. So this is why I said I think it's a bit more complicated, the place that relations need to have in Nagarjuna's philosophy. That's some high-level philosophical thought, but let's try to ground this in what Nagarjuna is actually saying. So this, I'm not going to read it, but this is a very well-known section in the Karikas where Nāgārjuna is arguing against his opponent who's just accused him of negating the Buddha's teachings. And Nāgārjuna's argument is that actually it's a feature of the Buddha's teachings that you need to teach the ultimate through customary ways of speaking. Sorry that my camera is blocking off some of that. But you need to teach about ultimate reality using these customary fictions which don't reflect that reality. And he thinks that this is necessary to even accept the Buddha's teaching, because he thinks that dependent arising, especially, can only make sense if the ontology in which it's couched is conventionally stipulated. So the big challenge I would have for this is how could it be possible that some fictions teach us about the ultimate reality better than others? It's important that you can't simply say that some fictions are more approximately true than others, because according to Nāgārjuna, there is no ultimately true ontology to approximate. So without a goal to approximate, then all fictions are equally fictional, surely. And Nāgārjuna kind of really owes us some account of what gives certain fictions this kind of privileged relationship with the ultimate truth. Because you can't just say that, well, everything is a fiction, but the fictions in my religion are what you need to follow, because that just sounds like dogmatism. You know, we want to hold him to a higher standard than that. So he needs to tell us what property these teachings can have, if not truth, that enables them to have this privileged relationship with the ultimate, that gives them the ability to lead us to the ultimate, where other teachings by other religions or by Barney the dinosaur or whoever can't accomplish. Why should we listen to Buddha and not anyone else if everything is a fiction? So I think we can solve this with reference to empirical relations. So if we look at the primary example of an efficacious fiction for Nāgārjuna, the chain of dependent arising, which he recites in orthodox form in chapter 26. We know from the previous 25 chapters before that he doesn't think that the ontology of dependent arising is ultimately real, it's merely conventionally stipulated. However, he might think that these conventional designations are associated with certain experiences. And in that case, what the teaching can do is tell us something about the relationships between these experiences. So in that case, the structure of those experiences is accurately represented by the structure of the teaching, of the fiction. So now I want to return to this distinction between relations and structure that I mentioned earlier. This is what ontic structural realists don't really observe, but most people do, and it was really important for some philosophical structuralists, for example, Bertrand Russell and Rudolf Carnap. For them, structure is the pattern formed by relations. So it's an abstract thing that is distinct from relations, but relations instantiate it. So greater than, for example, is a relation, so is bigger than, but the relation greater than forms the same structure in the set 1, 2, 3 as bigger than forms in the Eiffel Tower, Australia, and Jupiter. Don't worry, I have diagrams for you which can help explain this, and should be a little pointer thing here that you can see. So we can interpret these arrows as representing the relation greater than, and the arrows then show us the pattern that greater than forms between these objects. The same thing can happen over here, where these arrows represent bigger than, and that shows us the pattern that bigger than forms between these objects. And we can see that it's the same pattern. And that precisely is what's meant by structure in this sense. So I like this example because these are mathematical objects with a mathematical relation. These are physical objects with a physical relation, but they have precisely the same structure. And that's important because it shows us that structure is really ambivalent towards the nature of the relations that make it up. Um, Relations can share in structure, but have absolutely nothing to do with each other in terms of their nature or anything else. And we can know what structure a relation instantiates without knowing what its nature is or anything else about it. So with that in mind, the big suggestion I have for Nāgārjuna is that the structure of the fictional relations presented in efficacious discourse corresponds with the structure of the relevant real relations that we encounter in experience. When I say efficacious discourse here, of course, for Nāgārjuna, the main one is the Buddha's teachings, but this can also refer to instructions for how to start your car or scientific theories that are especially successful. In each case, what the actual content of what's being described, the ontology of it, may not be ultimately real, but it does have a structure, and that structure may or may not correspond with the structure of experience once we understand how the conventions presented in each fiction are supposed to relate to what experiences we may or may not have. So we can't say that any specified relation exists because we can only do so by situating that relation within some kind of ontology. And for Nāgārjuna, of course, all ontologies are merely conventions, they're conventionally stipulated. But we can say that fictions connect with reality, with the way that things really are, of tattva, via experience, via being associated with things that we really experience. And they share with reality that structure alone. So they don't share with reality the relations that they describe because, as we've just seen, the relations are fictional. They're based in an ontology that's merely conventionally stipulated. But that doesn't carry over to structure. They can share with reality structure even if the nature of reality is completely inscrutable to us. And this can explain why some fictions have that kind of privileged relationship with reality, why we still can communicate profound things about reality via fictions. So to wrap up, just to compare Nāgārjuna and Ontic structural realism again, are there relations for Nāgārjuna? Yes. I don't think we need to be too coy about that. We experience relations. It happens. The important qualification is that the nature of these relations can't be described because they can only be described as parts of conventional ontologies. Are they ontologically fundamental, as the OSRs want to say? Well, no, because a non-conventional ontology isn't possible. But there's still a kind of problem here where the arguments in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika can't really directly refute kind of ontic structural realism, mainly because ontic structural realism is the kind of thing that I think no one would have ever come up with kind of except in a post-Newtonian kind of physics perspective of things. So it's very contemporary by nature. So to defend kind of Nāgārjuna's insights into the conventional nature of ontology, we'll need to figure out why it's a misguided thing to say that, oh well, actually we can say that they're fundamentally real relations that make up reality. I've tried to do that with my philosophy of science hat on in another conference this year, and that should come out in the post-conference proceedings soon if you want to look out for that. But yeah, that's all I have to say for this topic. I hope that was helpful to you, And thank you very much for listening.